Good afternoon. Last week, for Sunday evening, we looked at Psalms 139, verses 13 through 16. And I gave a challenge for all of us to go and read that chapter and to study it. And I hope that you did. I hope that you sat down with your family and looked at this passage. Because today, we're going to be looking at the first 12 verses of this chapter. So if you have your Bible with you, please go ahead and turn to Psalm 139, and we'll be looking at verses 1 through 12. Now, to give context of this chapter, it's written by David. In saying that, it's a very personal psalm. Some psalms are very general, talking about God and talking about life, and they're very general. But this one is very personal. David opens up his heart and opens up his mind for God. Here we read that David is speaking about the bigness of God. Last week, Rodney talked about how Mary made God big and magnified him. And David does this here as well. Just to give you some numbers, okay? The speed of light goes at 186,000 miles per second. Imagine that. 186,000 miles per second. So to give you perspective into that, the circumference of the earth is 24,901 miles. Okay? Much smaller number. So moving at the speed of light, you could go around the earth 7.5 times in 1 second. So, boom, going at the speed of light, you've gone around the earth 7.5 times. Moving at that same speed, at 186,000 miles per second, it takes about 8.5 minutes from sunlight to come from the sun to the earth. So I want you to think of how big those numbers are. We can go around the earth 7.5 times in 1 second, and it takes light from the sun to get to the earth. It takes it 8.5 minutes. And if we were to go to the nearest star in the universe, besides the sun, it would take around 4 years from the light from the sun to reach that next star. What I'm trying to get at is the universe that we live in is big. And I can't even comprehend the size of it. There are stars out there that are bigger than the orbit of the earth around the sun. It's pretty big. And I've read that it would take 500 billion years to cover the perimeter of what scientists have seen out in the universe. People rarely live to be 100 years old, but it would take 500 billion years to cover the perimeter of what we've seen. That's not counting the things that we haven't seen. And God is big enough to hold it all in his hands. Here, this is what David is realizing in this psalm, that God is big, that God is bigger than we can understand. But something interesting is David realizes that God is a personal God, in that even though he has this huge universe, he can count the hairs on David's head, and he can count the hairs on my head and your head. So, and that's where we are in this psalm. We're going to break it up. We're going to look at verses 1 through 6 first, and then go to verses 7 through 12. Let's start off and just read verse 1. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. The word search here is the word search is in like an expedition or searching out a country, discovering and learning and experiencing. We read that God searches us, that God reaches into us and knows everything about us. Verses 2 through 4 says, You know me, when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You search out my path and my lying down, and you are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. Here we read that God knows all of our actions. It says, you search out my path and my lying down and are acquainted with all of my ways. Verse 2, you know when I sit down and when I rise up. So God knows how we sleep, our routines when we sleep, and He knows when we wake up and our routines when we wake up and everything in between. So think of all the phone calls you've made today or all the texts that you've made. God knows every one of them. Imagine, a spouse or a friend that knows, almost everything about you. They know you better than anyone else. And yet God knows the things that they don't know. God knows everything that we do. He knows all of our actions. And looking at verse 5, you hem me in, behind and before, and lay your hand upon me. The word hem. Now, in Mississippi, we only use this word hem with really one connotation. I don't know if it's the same up here in Tennessee. But working with animals is when we use the word, or is when I've used the word hem. My parents owned some goats, and one of them had a cut along its back, and it was scared and running from us, and we were trying to hem it up in the pasture and get it cornered against the fence. And I remember using the word hem a lot in that situation, and I don't use hem, use the word hem up, we're going to hem this or that in everyday life, but I use it with that. And I think of that goat and how he looked so scared, and he didn't want us to get to him, even though we were trying to help him, and we were trying to stitch him up and heal him, but he didn't want us to catch him. And I think sometimes when talking with someone who isn't a Christian, someone who doesn't know Christ, I forget that the thought of being hemmed in can be scary sometimes. Living in the darkness, living with injury. And then you see something, you see this light, you see God or God's people trying to hem you in. And the thought of it can be scary, the thought of being submissive to God and giving your life over to God. So I'm thankful that God hems us in and surrounds us. And I pray that we remember that people that haven't experienced that, it can be a scary thought for them. Moving on to verse 6, it says, such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high. I cannot attain it. So all the thoughts that God has, they're too high for us. They're too big for us. There's no way we can understand everything that God thinks. Now moving on to verses 7 through 12. 7 through 9 says, where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea. Verse 10, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. So here we read that there is nowhere we can go that God is not going to be there. If we ascend to heaven, or if we go to the uttermost parts of the sea, or if we take the wings of the morning, there's nowhere that God isn't with us. But more so than Him being with us, His hand leads us, and His right hand holds us. Verse 11 through 12, it says, if I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light about me be night. Even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is bright as the day, for the darkness is as light with you. I want you to imagine the darkest place you've ever been in. even so dark where you can't even see the hand in front of your face. Pitch blackness. And that's not dark to God, because he is light. And in Chorale at Freed Hardman, sang a song called Ride the Morning Winds, and it's about these verses here. And Gary McKnight, the director of it, and he's an elder at Estes Church of Christ, Henderson Church of Christ, he told us the meaning of the song, and the meaning is, no matter where life goes or what dark turns you might make, and those dark turns might come from anything, from loss of a spouse or loss of a friend or a job loss or whatever happens that brings darkness to our life. When we're about to make that turn into that, God is already there, and he's waiting for us. And he has his arms open to us in that moment. And sometimes I forget that. I forget that God knows everything, and that God is there waiting for me. I want to thank you for being with us today, for being with me right here in this thought. But I pray that the thought doesn't end here. I think we have a responsibility to our families to not let it stop here. And the point of this afternoon thought that we're having is to give you a challenge for the week and send you into the week with something to do. And the challenge for this week is try to find someone who's in that dark place in life and let them know that you love them and let you know that God is there with them. And if you're thinking of someone and trying to think of someone and you can't think of anyone in that situation, call a shepherd or call a deacon or Rodney or Marie. I'm sure they would love the encouragement. The other challenge that I have for us today is that this devotional thought not end here. I think men have a responsibility to their families to lead them to Christ. And if there's not a man in the household, then the woman, the spiritual leader, takes up that. And I realize that there are single people out there, and they have a responsibility to themselves to deepen their faith with Christ. So my challenge is to look at the rest of Psalm 139. Look at verses 17 through 24. Last week we looked at verses 13 through 16. This week, the first part of the chapter. And now look at the last part of the chapter. If you're all sitting together watching this as a family, why not do it right now? What's a better time to study God's Word than right now? And if you're having trouble studying or thinking of what to say or what questions to ask, some questions could be, with verse 17 and 18, to you, what are the most profound thoughts of God? And verses 19 through 22, who are those people that oppose God, that seek to degrade God and what he is? In verses 23 through 24, is there any grievous way in you? If so, what is it? I pray that you turn this 15-minute thought into a 30-minute thought or an hour-long thought with you and your family. So thank you for being with us today and for being with me in this thought. If you are a person that maybe is single and maybe doesn't have anyone to talk to about the Bible, call me up. I'd love to talk about it with you anytime. So thank you for being here. I love you and hope to be with you soon.